Hey beautiful, have you considered subscribing to our channel? Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers.
The sun hung low over the cul-de-sac, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. Birds chirped from nearby trees, oblivious to the tension building between two very different kinds of people. At the edge of the driveway, Michael stood next to his wife, Claire, both of them staring at the man in front of them with growing confusion. The HOA officer, a pudgy, middle-aged man with an expression as tight as his pressed uniform, was holding a gun. It gleamed under the sun, pointing directly at Claire. "You stay right where you are," the officer barked, his voice thick with authority. His hand trembled slightly around the grip of the firearm, but his stance was solid, as if he was trying to convince not just them, but himself as well, that he had control of the situation. Claire didn't move. Not even a muscle twitched. Her eyes, calm and calculating, remained locked on the officers. Michael could feel his heart hammering in his chest, but his wife was unnervingly still. The officer was shouting something else, but his words felt distant, like they were coming through a thick layer of fog. Michael's focus was entirely on Claire. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was watch her, waiting for some kind of response. Anything. "Didn't you hear me?" the officer growled, taking a step forward. His feet scuffed against the gravel, the sound breaking the tension. "I said." "I heard you," Claire interrupted, her voice a quiet contrast to the officer's harshness. She didn't raise it, didn't need to. Her tone was enough to cut through the noise. "Put the gun down." Michael's pulse spiked. There it was, the calm command he'd grown used to over the years. But this wasn't some petty disagreement at the grocery store, or a heated argument in their kitchen. This was different. The officer had a gun. Claire wasn't just his wife, she was Delta Force. And if he'd learned anything over the years, it was that Claire didn't make threats. She didn't need to. The officer didn't know that, of course. The man, still shaking slightly, seemed to take her words as a challenge, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You think you can just tell me what to do? You think you can make me?" "I'm not asking," Claire replied, her eyes hardening as she stepped closer to him, not backing down. The officer froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, Michael wondered if the officer would actually shoot her. But Claire didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, assessing him with the same analytical gaze she'd used countless times before. On the battlefield, in training, in every situation where the stakes were life or death. She was sizing him up. She was waiting for him to make a mistake. And he did. "I said," the officer repeated, but now his voice wavered. "I'll arrest you for..." "For what?" Claire asked, raising an eyebrow as she cut him off again. Her expression was calm, but there was an edge in her voice now. "You have no authority here. I'm not breaking any laws. I don't even know what you think you're doing." Michael could see the officer's face shift. The bravado began to crumble. His hand, which had been so steady moments ago, now wavered slightly, and Michael could hear the hitch in his breath. The realization hit, the officer didn't know how to handle this. He wasn't used to people like Claire. "You think you can just walk around," the officer began again, but now Claire's eyes were narrowing, and there was no more patience in her demeanor. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The moment was turning, tension crackling in the air like static. Michael could hear the rush of his own blood in his ears, the pounding in his chest still intense. His wife, the woman he had married, the woman he knew better than anyone, was handling this with the calm precision of a soldier. But he also knew something the officer didn't. Michael's thoughts flickered back to their first meeting. He'd been a civilian, lost in the quiet hum of his suburban life when Claire had come into his world. She'd walked into his life like a force of nature, beautiful, enigmatic, and impossibly composed. It hadn't taken long before he realized that she wasn't just any woman. She had a past. A dangerous one. But he loved her anyway. And now, here they were, facing down a small-town HOA officer who had no idea that the woman in front of him was a trained killer. The officer's voice faltered, his next words coming out in a stammer. You can't do this. You can't." But Claire took a step closer, her movements deliberate, controlled. The officer's gun, which had been aimed at her chest, trembled in his hand as she closed the distance. "Watch me," she said, her voice low, but the cold finality in her tone made it clear. There was no room for argument. The officer's face paled, the gun wavering more, his entire body visibly tensing. He knew. He realized too late what he had gotten himself into. Michael could see it. The moment of realization, the officer's internal battle of whether to back down or continue with this farce. "You should put the gun down," Claire repeated, her voice still calm, but there was no mistaking the command. There was no questioning her. The officer's eyes darted to Michael briefly, and for a brief moment, there was something almost desperate in his gaze, an unspoken plea for backup, for someone to come to his rescue. But no one came. Michael watched as the officer's hands shook. It was as though the weight of what was happening finally sank in. He was out of his depth. And then Claire made the final move. Without warning, her hand shot out, and with a swift, graceful motion, she grabbed the barrel of the officer's gun, twisting it from his hand before he could react. The officer stumbled back, his face turning an ugly shade of red as he yelped in surprise. What the hell? Claire stood there, the weapon now in her hand, but her gaze was still locked on the officer's. She hadn't fired a single shot. She hadn't needed to. The officer was standing in front of her, frozen, humiliated in the face of a woman who had seen far worse than him. Michael took a step forward, his breath steadying. It was over. But that wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. The officer's face twisted in confusion, his breath still heavy from the shock of being disarmed. He didn't understand what had just happened or how a woman, his supposed subordinate, could have turned the tables so easily. Claire didn't even look at the gun in her hand. She let it hang loosely, her fingers curled around the metal, but her gaze remained unwavering, locked on the man in front of her. It was as if she was trying to read his very soul, to anticipate his next move before he even made it. Now, Claire said, her voice measured and calm, but there was a biting edge to it now. What are you going to do? The officer's hand was still trembling. He took a step back, his mind scrambling for some kind of foothold in the chaotic situation. He had lost control, and his own fear was beginning to cloud his judgment. He was a small-town enforcer of petty rules and homeowner association guidelines. His role didn't prepare him for this. His breath hitched as he tried to recover, fumbling for some kind of authority that had long since slipped away. "Listen, lady," he stammered, his voice cracking, "I'm just doing my job." "You can't?" His eyes flicked toward Michael, standing silently by Claire's side, a quiet observer to the escalating crisis. "This isn't over." Michael's chest tightened. It was clear now that the officer wasn't just out of his depth, he was far too deep into this. He was in over his head, and the sheer absurdity of it all made Michael want to laugh. But he didn't. He couldn't. His mind was racing, trying to piece together just how this situation had escalated so quickly. Claire's eyes remained locked on the officer, unwavering. "You're right about one thing," she said, the coldness in her voice sending a chill through the air. "This isn't over." She glanced at Michael for a brief moment, her eyes softening, but only for a second before the ice returned. "But it's not going the way you think." The officer swallowed hard, his face reddening. He took another step back, unsure of how to regain the upper hand. His pride was bruised, his authority crumbling. He'd been the one with the gun just moments ago, but now he was nothing more than a figure of ridicule. Michael could see it in the officer's posture. He was floundering, desperate to find a way to salvage some kind of dignity from the mess he had created. "You think I'm afraid of you?" the officer barked, but the bravado was hollow, forced. "You're making a mistake." Claire let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh, like she was tired of this whole charade. "You're the one making the mistake," she said, her voice soft but unmistakable. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The officer's jaw clenched. "I'm calling the cops," he muttered, his eyes darting nervously toward the street, as if he expected backup to miraculously appear out of nowhere. He backed up a few more steps, fumbling for his phone, but Claire was already 2 steps ahead of him. Without a word, she took the gun in both hands, flipped it, and tossed it back to him. He caught it reflexively, his grip tightening around the cold metal. The movement was swift and deliberate, a gesture of control more than anything else. It was a silent message: "You're not in charge here." "Go ahead," she said, her voice laced with the faintest trace of amusement. "Call whoever you want. But you're not going to like how this ends." Michael could feel the weight of the moment settle between them, the words unspoken but understood. Claire had already won. It wasn't about the gun. It was about something far more lethal: the slow, steady erosion of the officer's confidence, the dismantling of his power before he even realized it. The officer hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the phone screen. But then, as if sensing the futility of his actions, he lowered the device and stuffed it back into his pocket. He let out a short, exasperated sigh, his shoulders slumping in defeat. For a moment, the silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. "Fine," he muttered, his voice small now, a shadow of the bravado it had once held. "You're right. This isn't worth it." He took one last lingering look at Claire, then at Michael before turning and shuffling back toward his squad car, his defeat as clear as the sun overhead. Claire watched him leave, her posture relaxed, but there was no trace of satisfaction on her face. There was no victory dance. No triumphant smirk. Just the quiet certainty that the situation had played out exactly as she knew it would. She had never intended to escalate things, she didn't need to. But the officer had made his move, and now it was time for the consequences to unfold, slowly and deliberately. Michael exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The tension in the air began to dissipate, but the weight of what had just happened remained. The officer was gone, but the ripple effects of this moment would stretch much further than either of them could have anticipated. "You good?" Michael asked, his voice low, still processing the bizarre encounter. Claire nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the officer's retreating figure. "For now," she replied. "But that's not the end of it." Michael raised an eyebrow, the question forming before he could stop it. "What do you mean?" Claire turned her head to meet his eyes, her expression unreadable. "You think he'll just walk away from this? He'll be back. And when he does, it's going to get uglier." Her lips curled into a faint, knowing smile, and Michael realized that this wasn't just a fight for control, it was something much bigger. Something Claire had already planned for. The adrenaline that had kept him on edge slowly began to ebb, but the sense of foreboding only deepened. Claire wasn't done with the officer. And neither was Michael. Not by a long shot. The sun had sunk beneath the horizon by the time the officer's squad car disappeared into the night, leaving the cul-de-sac eerily quiet. But the calm was deceptive. The tension in the air hadn't loosened, it had only shifted. Michael stood beside Claire, his thoughts racing, his mind unable to reconcile what had just happened. How had it escalated so quickly? How had it gotten this far? He glanced at Claire, still standing with her arms crossed, watching the road where the officer had gone. Her face was a study in concentration, as if she were already calculating the next move in a game he didn't fully understand. For a brief second he wondered what she was thinking. What did she know that he didn't? Claire finally turned to him, breaking the silence. "He'll be back. He doesn't know when to quit." Michael frowned, his brow furrowing. "You really think he's going to come back after all this?" His voice was thick with disbelief. "I thought we'd gotten through to him." Claire's gaze was steady, unwavering, her eyes reflecting something deeper than just the streetlight's soft glow. "He's not the problem," she said, her voice sharp but quiet. "It's the system. The HOA. The people behind him. They'll be the ones coming after us. And that's when things are going to get ugly." Michael's stomach tightened. "The HOA?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. He had heard the term tossed around during neighborhood meetings, but he had never paid it much mind. It was just another layer of bureaucracy to him, a distant annoyance that seemed to only concern a few of the neighbors. But Claire's words made it feel bigger, more dangerous. Claire nodded, her gaze still focused on the road as if she could see something Michael couldn't. "It's not just one officer. It's not just him. This is bigger. The HOA has a reach that you can't even imagine. And when you push them, they don't let it go." Her voice softened, her tone filled with a quiet intensity. "They don't lose." Michael could feel the knot in his stomach tighten further. This wasn't some petty squabble over a lawn ornament or a fence dispute. This was something far more dangerous, far more insidious. Claire's instincts were rarely wrong, and the seriousness in her tone sent a shiver down his spine. "I don't understand," Michael said, his voice low, hesitant. "I mean, it's just an HOA. What's the big deal? Why would they care so much?" Claire's lips twisted in a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Because they can. Because they believe they can get away with it." Her gaze flicked toward him then, and there was something in her eyes, something cold, calculating, and sharp. "They've been doing this for years, Michael. Pushing people around. Breaking rules. Using their power to control everything. You're just the latest target." Michael shook his head, trying to wrap his mind around it. "But what does any of this have to do with the gun? With him threatening you?" Claire took a deep breath, her posture shifting as she turned to face him fully. "Because they don't see people like us as equals," she said. "People with experience. People with power. They think they can bully us into submission. And when that doesn't work, they escalate. Like they did today." Michael felt a pang of frustration. "I don't get it. Why didn't you just tell him who you are? Who you used to be?" Claire's expression flickered just for a moment. "Because it's not about that," she said quietly. "If I tell him that I'm Delta Force, he doesn't stop being an arrogant fool. He just becomes more dangerous. People like him don't listen to reason. They listen to power. And they don't care who you were or what you've done, they only care about how much you can hurt them. It's about control, Michael. Always. The words sank in like stones and Michael began to understand. This wasn't just about a petty power struggle with some small-town officer. This was about something much larger. The HOA, a faceless bureaucracy that thrived on rules and regulations, had now made this personal. And Claire, his wife, the woman who could silence armies with a look, was caught in the middle of it. Before he could say anything else, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Michael pulled it out, seeing the text flash across the screen. His eyes narrowed as he read it, his pulse quickening. Officer Harris says you've got a choice. Step down. Or we make this ugly. Michael's grip tightened on the phone as he reread the message. He could almost hear the smug tone behind it, the clear implication that someone, some higher power within the HOA, was orchestrating this entire mess. He looked at Claire, his mind racing. This is it, isn't it? This is where it gets bad. Claire nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. We're going to have to play their game. And we're going to play it better than they ever could. There was no hesitation in her words. No doubt. Michael could see it in her eyes, the sharp, focused resolve of someone who had been through far worse and had come out victorious. He was beginning to realize just how much he had underestimated her, and how much she had been holding back all these years. He clenched his jaw, his mind already beginning to shift gears. So what do we do now? Claire's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. We start fighting back. But we do it their way. We make them think they're in control until it's too late. Then we expose them for what they really are. Michael felt a rush of adrenaline surge through him. They weren't just reacting anymore. They were taking the fight to the HOA, and they were going to make it hurt. But he also knew one thing. The real fight was just beginning. And they were only getting started. The following days blurred into a frenetic series of strategic moves and careful manipulations. Michael watched Claire work, her mind sharp as ever, every decision made with deliberate precision. The fire in her eyes, the way she carried herself, it was clear that she wasn't just protecting her family, she was preparing for something bigger. For once, the quiet, unassuming suburban life they'd settled into felt like a distant memory. Everything had changed in an instant. They'd collected every piece of information, every document, every detail they could on the HOA, the officers involved, the bylaws that governed their neighborhood, and the individuals behind the curtain pulling the strings. Claire had a way of digging into people's pasts, finding the cracks in their public personas, the ones they thought were well hidden. She wasn't just after a petty victory anymore, she was going to dismantle the system from the inside. Michael didn't fully understand the depth of it all until the day Claire laid out the plan. She sat across from him at their kitchen table, a map of the neighborhood spread out in front of her, the HOA's records scattered across the surface like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Here's where we hit them, she said, pointing to a section of the neighborhood where the HOA had claimed jurisdiction over shared community properties. This is where they have the most control, where they feel the most secure. And that's where we start turning the tide. She looked up at him then, her gaze steady. We're going public. We're going to make their dirty little secrets impossible to ignore. The boldness of her plan hit him all at once, like a surge of electricity. You're going to expose them? She nodded, unfazed. I'm going to expose the hypocrisy. The power plays. The way they've manipulated everyone for their own gain. Her eyes narrowed slightly. And if they think they're going to threaten us into submission, they're going to find out how wrong they are. Michael sat back, absorbing the enormity of her words. He had known she was capable, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about complete retaliation, about giving the HOA a taste of their own medicine. It wasn't just Claire they had to worry about anymore. The more Michael dug, the more he realized that the HOA's influence stretched far beyond his neighborhood. These people were in positions of power, and their network reached deep into local government, law enforcement, and even media outlets. But Claire had one advantage they couldn't see coming: the sheer unpredictability of her. She wasn't some passive bystander in this fight. She had been trained to win, to adapt, to move in ways that the average person couldn't comprehend. The longer Michael worked with her, the more he saw it. Claire wasn't just a soldier from a past life. She was a force to be reckoned with. That night they put the plan into action. Claire had arranged everything carefully, targeting a crucial meeting where the HOA was set to discuss new regulations that would restrict homeowner rights even further. The HOA president, a self-important man named Robert Finch, was known for his arrogance and his tendency to make everyone around him feel small. The perfect target. Michael and Claire stood outside the meeting hall, the hum of activity in the background as the HOA members shuffled in. The tension between them was palpable, but Claire seemed perfectly at ease, her mind focused. Her plan was unfolding as it should. As the meeting began, the board members settled into their seats, unaware of the trap being set for them. Claire had orchestrated the perfect setup. Videos, documents, and testimonies from disgruntled residents who had suffered under Finch's reign. They would be shown one by one during the meeting. Every secret, every illegal action, every shady deal would be laid bare in front of the very people who thought they were untouchable. Michael was stationed with the press, a small but determined group of journalists who had gotten wind of the scandal. They were on the edge of their seats, waiting for the first signs that this was more than just a community meeting. Then came Claire's cue. She stepped into the room, confident, her presence filling the space as all eyes turned to her. There was no hesitation in her movements, no second-guessing. She was in complete control and everyone knew it the moment she spoke. "Mr. Finch," Claire began, her voice cutting through the room like a blade, "I have something I think the board should see." She pressed a button on her phone and the projector clicked on. A series of images and documents flashed across the screen, evidence of bribery, corruption, and abuse of power. The room went silent. Robert Finch's face turned a deep shade of red, his eyes darting nervously as the documents continued to scroll. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some glancing at each other, others pretending to remain unfazed, but it was clear the damage had been done. "I've spent the last few weeks gathering everything," Claire said, her tone deceptively calm. "I've spoken with every single person you've trampled over, Mr. Finch. And now it's your turn to answer for your actions." Finch stammered, trying to maintain control. This is a violation of..." "Violation." Claire cut him off, stepping forward. "You're the one who's been violating the rules, the laws, the very foundation of this community. And now it's time for you to pay the price." The journalists were already snapping pictures, recording every word, capturing the chaos unfolding in real time. Michael watched from the back, his heart pounding in his chest. The plan was working. They had exposed the monster hiding in plain sight, and it was only a matter of time before the fallout reached every corner of the HOA. Claire turned to the press, her expression hardening. "You know what's coming next. The public deserves to know. Share this with everyone. Make sure it goes viral." As the room erupted into chaos, Claire turned and walked out, her mission complete. The rest would follow, and Robert Finch, along with the entire corrupt system he represented, would soon be dismantled piece by piece. Michael couldn't help but feel a deep surge of pride. This wasn't just victory. This was justice served in the most satisfying way imaginable. And Claire? She was only just getting started.